Dust rolled in sheets off the mule line as the scouts came in from the south, faces burned brown, shirts stiff with salt. Late summer heat pinned the canyon still. In the shallow shade of scrub oaks, a U.S. Army tent stood with its flap tied back and a general's chair facing the wash like a stage. The men on both sides of the dry creek stared without speaking. On one bank waited General Nelson Miles in a crisp coat and white gloves that refused the dust. On the other stood Geronimo, with a blanket over one shoulder, eyes steady, chin lifted just enough to show he had come on his own terms. Between them, wearing cast-off cavalry hats and cartridge belts polished by years of use, the Apache Scouts stood exactly where history needed them and where no one would remember them. In the middle, close enough to hear every word and too close to claim the credit. It was September 1886, Skeleton Canyon, just inside the Arizona line. For months, the Scouts had run down the same trails again and again, south to the Sierra Madre, north across the San Simon, over lava beds, through mesquite that tore shirts and skin. They knew where water held in tinajas and where a fresh shoe printed sharp in morning dust. When army columns stalled on empty tanks and bad guesses, the Scouts didn't. They spoke to families on rancherias in whispers and counted coals in cold camps to tell whether a fire had been raked a day ago or an hour. They weren't translators of words. They translated signs, and that was what brought a small party with white flags into the canyon that day. Chato rode in among them. He was small, with a careful way of moving that wasted nothing. Months earlier, he had ridden east with a handful of Chiricahua scouts as showpieces for the government. Train to Washington, reception halls, handshakes, portraits with cabinet men, after which they were told to return and keep the chase on. He had shaken hands because he believed it might end the killing quicker. Martin and Cayeta, two scouts who had acted as messengers for Miles, were there too. When Geronimo stepped forward, it was because the men in the middle kept the line from snapping. The general spoke, and the interpreter made the words flat as a report. Geronimo nodded. He had wanted assurances for his people, and Miles promised them, lay down arms and go east for a time, then a return to a western reservation later. Papers were drafted. Rifles were stacked. In the heat of that afternoon, the scouts understood they could see what they had been working toward without actually touching it. The surrender would have a date, a photograph, and a name attached to the white glove side of the creek, not the men who had threaded the canyons to get everyone there. Trains groaned at sidings for days after. Chiricahua families were loaded into coaches with guards at the doors. The scouts expected orders for new patrols or at least a short rest. Instead, guards gestured at them too. Chato, Martin, Cayeta, and dozens of their families were told they were traveling east as prisoners of war. No charges were read. The same hands that had taken their reports took their pocket knives and cartridge belts. They were hustled aboard under the same rules as the men they had hunted, the men they had persuaded to come in. From Skeleton Canyon, the track ran through El Paso, San Antonio, and along the Gulf until the country turned to marsh and the air turned wet. Fort Marion sat inside stone walls at St. Augustine, Florida, a Spanish fortress that held heat like a kiln. Prisoners slept in casemates with iron bars in windows cut for cannon. The scouts watched their children learn the harbor's tides and taste salt water. The army made a list and wrote Chiricahua prisoners across the top. Under it, they set every name, including the scouts' names, as if service and surrender erased to the same status when a pen touched paper. Meanwhile, back in Arizona, the scouts who weren't Chiricahua, the White Mountain, the Cybeque, the San Carlos men, were paid off and dismissed in ones and twos. Some had served since the 1870s under Al Sieber's hard eye. They had trailed Victorio and Loco and had taken bullets for commanders who rode in front only on parade. When the enlistments ended, The men turned in Henry rifles and Springfield carbines, picked up the Army shirts they had mended a dozen times, and walked home. There were no medals, only a final muster book, name, age, band, height, scars, and a remark column that fit a life into a single word: good. The government closed scout companies the way a store closes late on a weekday, blinds down, neat, quiet. In Florida, the month stretched and then changed address. In 1887, the Army moved the Chiricahua west by a different route to Mount Vernon Barracks outside Mobile. Alabama yellow fever lived in the summers. The Scouts worked gardens, mended fences, and watched trains pass with people who had never heard of Skeleton Canyon. Their pay stopped when their enlistments were ruled done. The word they had taken in Arizona, that service would count, that a return west was in view, drifted out of reach. Back in Arizona, the land the Scouts had helped secure accelerated toward something else. Rail spurs cut into new mines. Surveyors set up tripods where brush once hid a cooking fire. Tom Horn, once a civilian interpreter riding with Sieber, turned to stock detective work. The Apache Kid, a former scout named Haskay Bay Nain Tail, got caught in a camp quarrel that spiraled into arrests, an escape, and a legend that newspapers wrote to their liking. The old companies that had once moved in single file under a gray dawn were now stories Ranger captains told to green recruits about how hard men used to be. In 1894, the government moved the Chiricahua again, this time to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Grass rolled out in slow swells. The Scouts built houses out of boards that didn't quite fit and tried to make small farms stand against wind and memory. Chato's house stood neat, with a fenced patch of corn. He was allowed to travel for a time to show fairgrounds in Omaha and Buffalo, where people paid to see real Indians ride past grandstands. He shook hands there too, quieter than he had in Washington, and went back to Fort Sill each time because that was where the Army said he belonged. Through it all, the paperwork kept pace. War Department files recorded rations issued, school attendance, the purchase of seed corn, and the number of cattle assigned to each family. The men in those pages who had led patrols without maps now signed for flour with excess and sat on benches while officers explained that their service was appreciated, but their status remained prisoner. The scout companies existed on paper a little longer than they existed in the field. By the turn of the century, the Army had reimagined its Indian Scouts as a military tradition, useful in history, ceremonial in the present, not needed in payroll. Some of the dismissed Scouts found work as reservation police or woodcutters for agency sawmills. Others drifted between camps, tying fences for ranchers who paid in beans and tobacco. They had learned how to track men across stone. There wasn't much call for that, unless the county wanted someone followed or a prospector went missing. The skill that had won a war in the canyons had no title in peacetime. A few names lingered. Mickey Free, the mixed-blood scout whose kidnapping years before had set part of the conflict in motion. Martine and Cayeta, who had spoken across the line at Skeleton Canyon. Chato, who kept his little farm as neatly as he kept his gear. Most names did what the Army's remark column predicted. They disappeared cleanly. In 1913, the government finally paroled the Chiricahua as a group. Families divided between Fort Sill and Mescalero in New Mexico, choosing new homes according to marriages, cousins, or the simple pull of hills that looked more like the old country Chato moved to Mescalero. He lived long enough to stand by a Model A Ford on the agency road and watch children shake their heads at the shape of his saddle. He died in 1934 when a car struck the wagon he was riding, a quiet end on a modern road for a man who had spit dust in a general's tent. Skeleton Canyon today is a crease of rock and mesquite where the wind clicks pods together and the sun still presses down the way it did that afternoon. If you walk its wash and look for the exact bend where two parties faced each other, you won't find a marker for the men in the middle. The record books placed Geronimo's surrender on a line and put miles in a photograph and move on. The Scouts do not move on in those pages. They stop. Their last ride is a paper discharge, a guarded train ride, a relocation notice, and then a family ledger opened to a new reservation with blank lines to fill. This isn't the kind of ending that calls attention to itself. The Scouts did not form a reunion post or mint a medal to explain it. They watched their sons play baseball on agency diamonds and their daughters plat straw to sell at the trading post. They told parts of the story over coffee outside the commissary and left out the parts that were nobody's business. When a rancher asked about tracks in a wash after a stray went missing, a former scout might say which way the cow had gone and how many hours ago, and that would be enough for that day. In the canyon, the wind wears the edges off new stones and old ones without preference. A man reading the ground there hears the same quiet talk the Scouts heard, where someone paused, where someone turned back, where someone kept going when he shouldn't have. It was the same language the Army used them for, and the same language that didn't fit into a citation afterward. The work ended when the rifles were stacked at Skeleton Canyon. The men who did the work were folded into trains or walked home with their pay, and between those two outcomes lay the space where a nation writes its memory. Most of the Scouts stepped into that space and kept walking until the wash bent out of sight. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.